Okay, excellent. Let us begin. I will start informally by saying, David, thank you so much for being here. I know it's relatively early in the morning for you, but this is an exciting opportunity for us. We always speak in our BFA program and the liberal arts that we are interested in creating international links to be connected to a larger community. And this is a great opportunity of doing this. But let me move to a more formal introduction. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today, wherever you are. My name is Achia Anzi. I'm the director of the BFA program at Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. We are hosting today David Dixon, an artist, curator, organizer, gallerist, so many things. I'm going to read the bio as customary, and I'm thanking him again for joining us. I will start with the bio, then I will introduce what we are going to do here today, and then we will just jump into the conversation. David B. Dixon is an artist, filmmaker, curator, and currently founding director of the art gallery project Cathouse FUNeral Proper, which opened in Brooklyn in 2013. His work has been exhibited at MoMA, Sculpture Center, Anthology Film Archives, Postmasters Gallery, Ryan Lee Gallery, as well as within his own Cathouse projects. He has lectured at Harvard University, New York University, School of Visual Art, Hunter College, Taylor College of Art. He currently teaches a professional practices course at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, which is also part of this event, and we are welcoming the student of Pratt Institute as well. Publications that have covered his work include Brooklyn Rail Art Forum, Art Critical, Huffington Post, The Guardian, Hypernergic. He was born in Philadelphia, PA in 1968 and raised in North Carolina. I think that's important for some of the artworks that we will see here today. He holds a BFA from Pearson School of Design and MFA from Cornell University. David, thank you so much. I have to add on a personal note that apart from this impressive short bio, I stepped into David's space, into the gallery, and that was the most interesting things that I've seen in the last summer in New York. And we started having a conversation, continuous conversation, which is fascinating. And today we are going to discuss some of the projects that David did as a curator, as an artist within his own gallery, but also a solo project. It's the interface between his work as an artist and as a gallerist is fascinating, not always easy to understand, and I think this is what we will try to decipher together today. And instead of just having a presentation, we are going to engage in conversation. Conversation will go around 15 minutes, 1 hour, but then we are going to open the stage. We are going to have half an hour of Q&A. I'm sure our students will have a lot to learn and to discuss. So yeah, I think we can jump in, we can start. We are going to speak specifically about one of the recent group exhibition, which was shown in Cathouse, Diasporic, Anthropic, Deremption, and the Cross-Cultural Cross, a very long and complicated name. And if I may add, also a very complicated exhibition, not only because there are different perspectives about the subject of identity, colonialism, immigration, etc., but also because each of the practices is so different and unique. And on top of this, the curation of the space and the integration of the artworks together adds not one, but several layers of meaning into what was happening in this space. So we are going to discuss this. And I will ask, first of all, David, the most trivial question. And I think this is something which will be of great interest to our students. The normal path of an artist is to finish BFA or MFA, start exhibiting wherever possible. Nowadays, it's common to see artists taking their own initiatives, and the Cathouse seem to be, one of those, which is instead of sitting and waiting for opportunities to come. I heard some artist gallerist once saying, I want to create opportunities to see the arts that I like and the works that I appreciate. So I'm curious to hear, in your case, how do you see the relation between your work as an artist and your work as a curator, organizer, and a gallerist? And we can take it from there. Thank you,
Yeah,
David.
well, I had to put my glasses on initially just to see Oshika's, what she had on her head. And I was like, what? And then, so now I'll keep them for now, but I had to get that out of the way so I can concentrate. Yeah, I got a BFA, right out of college situation, but I didn't go to MFA until much later. You touched on that a little bit, considering that I was already in New York and I had a good studio, and I felt like that would be enough, and I would meet people and make my work, and everything would evolve from that. And it did, to a degree, but I started to see that there may be some limitations from not having the MFA. And then at some point, and I think it's good to take a break there. We've been talking a lot about these kind of situations in the professional practice class at Pratt, but to take a break between the BFA and MFA, almost so that you really can enjoy the MFA, because it ends up being like a vacation, compared to having to work all day and then make art at night, or however you may have to structure your day. The MFA, it becomes like a 2-year period where you can focus on the work. So not a vacation, but an artwork vacation, let's say, from life. But that the notion of life actually is it's in the piece behind me here, but it's with the slogan for the gallery, which is life to art to life. One of the slogans, I kind of change them periodically, but life to art to life. And this notion would be a separation between art and life. There was a kind of 20th century notion of folding art into life in a sort of a political move, so that art and life are one. And you can almost see that in the Soviet state, where and Goris Boris writes about that in the I've got the book right over here, in his, The Total Art of Stalin, where he reads the Stalinist regime as being this sort of manifestation in union with the avant-garde, which is a really interesting thesis. We won't go into it now, but the idea of keeping art and life separate, so that you have a place for reflection back on life. So of course, these are fine lines. Of course, art is a part of life. I mean, it's not as if but it does represent possibly a transcendent space, or a space outside of the quotidian, so that you can refer back and get perspective on, both in a political sense and in a psychological or in a transcendent sense, on experience itself. So I guess started the gallery first. I spent about, I think, in kind of 10-year groups, it's kind of evolved that way in my life. I don't even call it a career. I say my life, where it seems like there's 10-year blocks. So I spent about a good 10-year block making feature films. I made 2 feature films. One's titled Unloosened and Root, and the other one's titled David Dixon is Dead. So that you can see with maybe where the David Dixon is Dead film led into opening the gallery, because that film I like to call the end of my youthful narcissism. So it was a way for me to, in a kind of grandiose sense, in the most narcissistic sense, see my own death. So in the movie, I die, and a variety of other things happen. But within the film too, there's already some of my, it's involved with my physical art practice. You say painting, sculpture, and performance. It was a way to contain, in a larger context, the individual works that I was making. So that too, that kind of sensibility of trying to nest things within things, nest smaller things and larger things to give narrative context to the work, was also a tendency that I had even in the filmmaking period. So the gallery almost, I mean, I think of the gallery in the show that we have up now, which is called Cul-de-sac. the gallery I think of in narrative terms too, where each of the exhibitions are kind of, you might say, a scene within the larger structure of the Cathouse FUNeral project, which is now on 10 years. And a lot of the shows interlock. So there's physical, formal, not only conceptual relationships, especially in the earlier space, the FUNeral space, which I pronounce it FUNeral. I emphasize the fun. So although it's spelled funeral, so it's Cathouse FUNeral. But in that space, the walls were changed, and for each exhibition, and then that whatever artist was coming up, we would keep the walls, parts of it the way that it had been built, and then add to it or subtract. So that the space itself, by the end, which that space ran for about 3 years, had taken on a lot of its own physical sculptural consequence. So this is one of the things that evolved out of working with the gallery too. And this piece behind me, which has the gallery logo in it and some other things going on, but that's harvested. That's another term that I started to come up with in a method to make my work, let's say, my art pieces, which would be signed by the gallery and myself, but they were harvestings, meaning they were taken from the context of the exhibitions. So like the walls, if the walls were treated in a particular way, or something that seemed to have its own inherent aesthetic value, but that also could be a relic of the exhibition, to get beyond just photographic documentation of the events, which I think of the exhibitions like events. So they pass in time, so the exhibition, the art object that's in the exhibition may live on, but the exhibition itself is performative in the sense that it only functions in a limited amount of time. So the harvestings were meant to preserve some of the qualities from those, or even as a memento mori of those, of the exhibitions. Now, not every show produced a harvesting, and it wasn't systematic. It was like, that's why I called it a harvesting. It would just sort of grow on its own, and then I would recognize it and remove it, keep it, frame it, like this back here. And this one's like in Duchampian terms, a kind of assisted harvesting, in that I painted on it and did some other things to it, whereas some of them are just completely lifted in a ready-made like way from the exhibitions.
Thank you very much for this rich response. And when I visited the gallery, it was actually some remnants from the earlier exhibition were part of the installations that I saw. And I think that any one of us who is working in the context of installation or alternative media nowadays can sense the need to give life to the exhibition, to continue to breathe even after the exhibition is over. So this is done in a very interesting way, and the dialogue continue to happen not only conceptually, but also visually. Maybe we will come to this later when we will see some of the images. I want to touch upon your role in the exhibition Diasporic, or the cross-cultural cross. I'm trying to find short name for it. And because in that particular exhibition, I'm thinking about your position. I was thinking about this today when I was going through it again. And I was thinking that there are several complications, not only negotiating your place as an artist and as the curator, and there are some strategies that you're using which are very interesting, which I would like to speak about them as well, but also about your position in terms of identity versus the other artists who participate in the exhibition. In fact, some of this came up also in the online conversation that you had. So maybe before that, instead of me trying to introduce this exhibition, maybe you can do it yourself and also speak about your position within it.
Yeah, you want to jump right into the complicated stuff, even before they've seen the exhibition, or the potentially, I mean, lightly anyway, controversial element, which as far as subject position, we're talking about race basically. So I'm very white man, and everybody else in the Diasporic and Tropic Direction show was African American or of some African descent. So and I was the curator of the show, but then I also had some of my own work that related to the structure of the show in the exhibition. So, and I think the moment you're referring to is in Brooklyn Rail did a new social environment, which if you haven't seen these broadcasts that the Brooklyn Rail does, they're pretty phenomenal. They started during COVID, but the new social environment, they do 5 a week with an artist of note and they have an exhibition up or something. But but in the talk, because I was the curator, the moderator started with me, and left, like, Neri Ward, Renee Cox, some quite very well-known artists that were in the show, to go afterwards. So I was talking on and on about the exhibition, and someone in the comments wrote, with all these powerful and interesting African-American Black artists, why is the white guy starting? So, and then the Brooklyn Rail wrote back, the white guy's the curator, which I like I was telling, I think that's why you're mentioning it, right? I was saying that I think that should be a title of a show at some point, the white guy's the curator.
Maybe,
not to make light of the situation, because it was a kind of fascinating place and position to be in, which took, I guess, 10 years of curating in the gallery to get myself to a place where I felt like I could navigate the complexities of those kinds of relationships, and also create a situation where the artists felt like they could trust that kind of structure, and ultimately it was very fruitful, because starting the gallery for me was with this end or death of my youthful narcissism, as I call it, was that I could work with others, and with art production, unlike literature, although maybe there's limits there too. I mean, there definitely are, but when you make a painting, it's viewed and understood from your subject position. When you write a book, say, you can couch different points of views and different characters. So with art, you always seem to have to speak about your story in some way, or it always becomes back about your story. So curating was a way for me to engage with other people's stories, but still maintaining a sort of creative relationship with production and with the exchange with the artist. So it started with just thinking about working with others, meaning others with a lowercase o, and then ultimately too, you end up working with others, capital O, that have different subject positions and often have complicated histories. So you can try to navigate those waters and produce something potentially enlightening.
Yeah, enlightening indeed. Why, David, why don't we start sharing some images so we can go to the page of the exhibition?
Are you going to drive that?
If you want, I can do it, or maybe you will do it. It will be easier for you. You know your website better.
Okay. So I should share my screen.
Yes, please.
Okay. You guys will see yourselves here in a minute. And then, all right. Is that good? We're there?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's the current show being installed. But we don't need to talk about that necessarily, Kia. I think that you have kind of a more interesting program in mind already. So
we can jump into I want to show some images from the exhibitions that we are discussing.
Right. The one we were just talking about, obviously, right?
Yeah.
Right on. There it is. So there's the title, which maybe it's good to see rather than just hear. I was abbreviating it as DED and the cross-cultural cross, or DED and the CCC, which sounds like I don't know. I like the sound of it. And I like the dead, DED spelled dead, sort of, at least if you read it, pronounced it. So we can go through. Should I just start going through the show, Achia? Or?
Yeah, just a very quick, just a short introduction. So we will all be on the same page, and then we can continue to go to other questions.
Right. So the gallery is not large, and it has these entrance halls, which also function as part of the exhibition space. So I'll just quickly give you a sense of the space so that, and then we can go back and look at the individual works. But you come in like that, that's Frank Francis piece. You can see the David Hammond's flag there on this home. And then you come around a corner, it looks a lot smaller there than it is, but there's you come around this corner and then you come around this, then you make a left and it opens up like this here. So that over here where this platform is the main large space that has like 20-foot ceilings. So it lends itself to some, I mean, it has already, the space itself has this wonderful kind of first, second, third act kind of narrative structure where people that don't know the space, they walk in and you don't expect it, because I don't think I have any pictures of the entrance here, but it's a side door on a street, you know, that looks like you're going basically into a closet or something. And then when you go up the steps, it opens up. So when people, they don't expect it's in a brown, it's in like a, you know, a brownstone building. So you don't expect to have these large kind of rooms in a space like that. So there's already that kind of working for the exhibitions. It creates a certain drama. So that platform was built for this show in particular. So because realizing that I had these 20-foot ceilings, is that you could put a floor in and still have plenty of space going up. So these windows you see are what would have been the brownstone's original windows. So that would be first floor, second floor. So we'll keep going down through the hall here. That's Cecile Fremont stuff. Yep. And then boom, you come around here to the corner. That's Nary's piece. That's the Klansman. And so you see, this is the platform that was built for the show. And there's a ladder there in the center that's upside down. So you go, this is about 5 feet high. So you have to duck to get under it. And so there's some exhibition going on underneath the platform, and everything underneath the platform is upside down. So the bottle you see that's by Frank Francis is hung upside down. So the artist allowed me to do that. And then Daniel Swanigan Snow's piece Tier is kind of flipped upside down. And then you walk up the ladder from this sort of underworld. And then this is sort of the above conscious world, you might say. And then this is Renee Cox's spectacular piece, which we can talk about, which I also exhibited as a solo show, just this piece, because it's worthy of attention on its own. And this is kind of facing the opposite direction from Renee's photograph. These are Cota reliquaries that collector Al Bolton, who's also an accountant and my accountant for myself and the gallery, but he's an avid collector and goes to Burkina Faso every year. And he's got a pretty extensive collection of Cota reliquary objects. And Cota reliquary objects, you'll note, are in my gallery logo. So when I was dealing with David Dixon is Dead in the film, I was looking into a lot of death rituals and traditions of death ritual. And one of the ones that struck me the most were the Fang and the Cota. And so I was like unbelievably thrilled to be able to have real Cotas in the exhibition. Installed here, I mean, we'll go into, maybe I should start going into detail, but installed here in a way that you won't see at the Met and are actually more accurate to the way that they would have been used with the Cota, which is in Gabon, that area of Africa now. But you see here, this is kind of the theme of the show, is this diamond shape, which are often confused with like legs for these figures, but it's a diamond shape, and it would have sat down in a basket, and half of the diamond would be beneath the basket and the other half above. And in the basket, this is a pedestal that I built and then cut a hole out, but in the basket would be ancestral skulls. So you would have like up to 8 generations of ancestral skulls, where this diamond shape has a ball on the bottom that would touch the sacra, it's called, like the actual skulls. And then and ritualistically or yearly or annually or in some form, the skulls will be taken out and remembered. So they were an archive and form of cultural memory, and also a religious practice, because they connected the living to the afterlife, where the ancestors would have resided, and the skulls would represent individual, like people of import from the past. But of course, when the colonialists went to West Africa, one of the first things they did was separate or sever the relationship between the sculpture and the sacred material. And then, of course, these sculptures of what we find in Paris in the early 20th century, and Picasso collecting the first African art object that Picasso collected was a Kota reliquary object. So, you know, all of that to me is relevant and interesting to use in the gallery logo, and to have it here sort of encapsulated in the show, in that there's not only is it an appropriation in this, a cultural appropriation in the sense of Picasso appropriating the Kota, then, you know, I'm kind of appropriating the history of the 20th century and Picasso's appropriation. So, and then we have this boat, which is the Santa Maria, which wouldn't have been a slave ship, but was one of the original Columbus ships that, you know, came to America. And this is a model ship built by my grandfather in 1926. So I had the ship around me, you know, my entire life, basically. So, and it's interesting once growing and educating and learning how the context and understanding of this object can change over time. Back again, so another view. So this is the hole that you go down the ladder. This floor, so we're going to get to the floor, Achia, right? Because the floor is plywood, and I painted the floor in this kind of checker pattern, because often I feel like American race politics are discussed in terms of like a chess game, where it's the blacks against the whites, you know, and they're in somehow opposition. So here the black and the white actually kind of fuse a bit, and there's some footsteps that go from the white paint into the dark paint and vice versa. So there's a meshing, let's say a cultural meshing. And so later we'll see that I used this plywood in this harvesting like way that we're talking about. I took the plywood up and used it in a show in Beacon, New York, an off-site show that happened last summer. And as a backdrop, it became like an altarpiece. So the entire floor, so that was like 16 feet by, it was a big thing. We'll look at it in a minute. So maybe some questions, Achia, or I could.
Yeah, I think I already said that the exhibition is very, very rich, and we would like at the end of it to focus on your role, but I think we should touch upon some of the works. And since you mentioned Renee Cox, and I think that her work is very central to what is happening in this exhibition, maybe we can start there. And what I would like to ask later is also, there is an interesting story of this work in this exhibition. In the last week of the exhibition, you had to remove it. And your decision...
Yeah. Oh, you took good notes. Yeah.
But this, yeah, absolutely. When I research. And instead of leaving an empty wall, which was also a possibility, you have decided to do something which is somewhere between curatorial intervention to artwork by an artist, a response to another artist. So I would like to explore that as well. I think the images also exist in this page. So maybe we can start with the origin of Renee Cox and then move on to your intervention.
Yeah, that'll fuse several moves in an interesting way, speaking about Renee's work and then its relation to the gallery in this exhibition. I'm really glad that you noticed that, Achia. And that's another example of a kind of harvesting, in the sense that the exhibition itself starts to produce the work. So I'm going to go back then, in that case, to the original exhibition that had Renee's, where we originally showed Renee's work. So this work itself has like a really great story behind it. Really interesting and relevant. And we got good write-up here by Janet Jikos in the Brooklyn Rail about it. But you'll see it here, originally installed in the gallery. So here you get to see the gallery without the platform, and it's a beautiful space, as you can see. And originally the idea for me in this particular space, because I came from another space, which we'll see some pictures of, which was a very cluttered and colorful spot. So I ended up in this perfect white cube. And I wanted to show one work at a time by an artist, by a contemporary artist of note. So they were going to be called solo shows, because as you see, the space isn't really big, but it's kind of ideal for exhibiting a work like right on that wall. So I wasn't able to really maintain that rule, there were several solo shows that were produced, and this being one. And Renee's piece there on the left, you see I'm circling it, is called Yo Mama. It's a photograph. It's like 7 feet tall. That's Renee herself holding her son. She's wearing high heels. She's naked otherwise. This is a very controversial work in some ways. It was shown in 1993 in Marcia Tucker's Bad Girls show. And Renee had conceived of the work, and she was a young artist at the time. You can see this is about her age. I guess she was 30 something. She conceived of the work as a diptych, but the show that Marcia Tucker wanted to put her in, and this was going to be her big break as an artist, was called Bad Girls. And she didn't want any like naked guys in there. So she just took half the diptych. And Renee, wanting to show the work, of course, and it was powerful on its own, she showed which then became titled Yo Mama, meaning your mama, you know, in kind of slang talk. So, and I love it, you know, your mama, it's, and she's looking down, her gaze is directly at the audience or the viewer. So, and then she sold out the edition in that exhibition, and she got quite a lot of notoriety for the piece. But then no one ever knew that it was meant to be part of a diptych. So I did a studio visit with Renee with this solo sort of notion in mind, at the request of Elena Simone, who was working with Renee at the time. And the first thing I saw behind Renee's desk was this David on the right. She calls it the David. He's in the pose of Michelangelo's David. And he's holding a book by Sheikh Anta Diop, The African Origins of Civilization. Amazing book. Everyone should read that for sure. And Renee describes it like he's, instead of a sling, like David would be holding a sling to slay Goliath, he's holding knowledge, and he's holding the book. So, when I saw this behind, I was like, oh, wow, what's that piece? That's amazing. And she was like, oh, it's a part of this diptych that Yo Mama. And I knew Yo Mama. Everybody knew this piece, Yo Mama, from the 90s. And I was like, it's a diptych? I can't believe it's a diptych. And I was like, it took like 5 minutes for us to determine what the show should be. I was like, let's show that. Oh, my God. So anyway, so it's been revived now as its own edition. So Yo Mama sold out its edition. Now this is a separate edition. And there it is. So it's an amazing piece, right? So Adam and Eve kind of image of African origins. And so then we go back to DDED and the cross-cultural cross. Yes. And we see that she and they're in the same position. Origins is in the same position, but they've ascended the wall about 5 feet, which I really like the fact that there's this kind of rising and ascending. And as Neri pointed out when we were talking about the piece, that they're sort of the reigning deities over this kind of sacred installation. Now, the third iteration of this would be, as Achia's mentioning, now I extended the show. The show was up for, a couple months or whatever, and we had a pocket there, and I extended it for a week. And I sort of extended it before I asked any of the artists or told them, and already announced it. And then Renee said, hey, I already promised the piece to somebody else, and it was supposed to open like the week after it closed. So I had to ship the piece out. So it disappeared. And of course, it's like, the cornerstone of the exhibition. So what do? You don't want to leave the space empty for the last weekend. And that's what gets the sort of wheels turning. And then it was like, well, how are we going to deal with this void? And I made this piece then to notify sort of the absence of origins. So I titled it Ascension, and it was Easter weekend too, which was one of the nice twists on it. So, Christ rising to heaven post-mortem. So I titled it Ascension, as if this is the veil now that has covered the lost origins, and you zoom in on it. And this is a photograph of Eternal Ancestors, which is a book that I learned most of what I know about the Kota and the Fang at the Metropolitan Museum. That was from 2006. So that's the catalog from that exhibition. But it's photographed with Renee's postcard, the postcard from the exhibition, sitting on top of it, and this silver cross underneath Renee. So all that's in the photograph. And then it's photographed with this little sort of hot spot in the center. And then this diamond shape is nailed with a rusty nail into the picture, and it's what holds it to the wall. So that's a bronze cosmogram. So the cosmogram, like we were talking about with the Kota, this diamond shape, is the sort of leitmotif or the theme of the exhibition that runs through the whole thing, because the cosmogram shape, which is best maybe expressed in Neri's piece, and Cecile, who's the scholar that at Yale that informed a lot of my understanding in this book, of this exhibition, and then included her book, and she included some of her original illustrations from this book, which is called The Art of Conversion, which is another text I highly recommend. And it's about the Portuguese first arrival in the Congo and the way that the Portuguese and the Congolese had a space of consilience or convergence, she calls it, around the notion of the cross, because the cross had already pre-existed the arrival of the say Christians or the Western culture. So so you can, in the way that we're describing here in this diamond shape, so that diamond contains the cross. And this is the crossroads representation that you see runs through Western African culture. And also you can see, you know, pretty much permeates civilization, you could say, or world culture, and very likely finds its source here at the origins in West Africa. It's also in Egypt and Northern Africa. When you think of like pyramids, they're built based on this diamond and cross shape. So so Neri's piece is yeah, Neri's piece, there's a whole story behind Neri's piece too, which you can see the cosmogram drilled into this American history book. Achia, help me out.
Yes, I was about to stop you and say that before speaking about Neri, I want, since in my conversation now, I'm trying to focus on your role as a curator and an artist, and I think those should be considered together. You placed along with his book your own artwork, which was produced separately. Very, very interesting, coming from a very, very different place. Both the work are, both works are, you know, dealing with the materiality of the book, but also engaging very differently with the possibility of reading, not reading, and I think represent where you and Neri are coming from, your subject position, as you said before, your different subjects position. So I'm maybe you can elaborate on this, speaking about Neri's work in relation to your work, placing your work next to him. Later on, you expanded this work and in the exhibitions that you did in Beacon, which we will also spend some time looking at. And you did some more intervention with more books which are coming from racist American literature.
Yeah, so this is kind of the crux of this black-white issue that's in the exhibition, and me being the white curator and the rest of the artist being of African descent. So yeah, rather than run away from that black-white checkerboard that we're talking about, I kind of wanted to run into the fire next time, you might say. And this book sort of encapsulates that and those concerns. And Neri's book. So yeah, Neri's book, there's a big story behind this, in the sense that I did a show which we can look at, Leaving Home in Beacon in 2017, which was again based on the notions of crossing borders, that one in specific. And I knew Neri had been dealing with this cosmogram in his own work. So, and I've known Neri for some time. So I asked him if he had anything for that show. That was back in 2017. That would be small, so that at least I could have the conversation around the work. Nothing, not a major piece. And he said he didn't have like any little drawings or sketches. So he went back to the drawing board and thought about it. And he came out and he made this book specific, because he felt like in his own cosmogram work, a lot of people, because he, we're talking about it in terms of Underground Railroad and sort of Black history, but not American history. And he wanted to make sure that people understood that this was American history. And so he's screwed or he drilled the cosmogram into an American history book with these nails. I can go into a little bit. Neri saw the cosmogram for the first time on the drilled into a floor of the First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia, which was very likely a station on the Underground Railroad. And there was a cross space under the church that had holes drilled in this configuration into the floor. So it was an African Congolese symbol in a Baptist American Black church. And, you know, maybe that seems surprising, but if you think of the term, and this is part of the things I'm running into with researching and trying to understand the early Christian notions of the cross, it relates to baptism already. And the cross comes from Southern Africa already. So you're going below the horizon with this vertical and this horizontal. You're going below the horizon into the underworld and then rotating back up to the conscious world. So the line, the crossbar is the horizon line, and then there's the ancestral world and then the conscious world above. It's the 4 moments of the sun, as Robert Farris Thompson calls it in his 1985 catalog for a show that was in Washington, D.C. called 4 Moments of the Sun, where a lot of this research first came to light to sort of, you know, Western consciousness, because no one stopped to ask, you know, when they were stealing the stuff from Africa. So so my response to this Neri book that then he makes in 2017, so we show it in 2017, and then I'm like, Neri, can we bring that piece back for this show? Because it's, like I'm saying, one of the conceptual cornerstones of the exhibition. And he's like, of course. And not only that, we did a trade. So I now own that piece, and I gave him this book. And I also gave him another piece because he deserves more than more than me in the situation. So Neri has this book now. So this exchange occurred. And I kind of started thinking about these Klansman books, which I'd already been reading before 2017. I discovered them back in like 2013 when I was first looking into the cosmic ram notions and this cross ideas. And you can see on this book, the Klansman, there's a circle and a cross. The circle and a cross, which is also on the front of that ship, is it's the Celtic cross, but it was also, so the crosses that the Portuguese were bringing to West Africa were predated Christianity, even in European sensibility. So this is a Celtic cross of a cross in a circle, the Sun Cross it's called. So and the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, appropriated this cross as their primary symbol. So because the Celtic connections, because the Klan by and large are Scotch-Irish, and the first 6 members were Scotch-Irish and from North Carolina in this sort of Piedmont region, which is where I'm from. So I was born in Philadelphia, and this is where Achia, it's relevant to the work, but I moved to North Carolina when I was young, like 8 years old. So I was brought up in the South, but not of the South in a certain way, even though I do have other relatives from the South. But the Klansman here is spelled with a C. Now, this guy was aware of the Klan with a K, the KKK, but he's referring back to the Celtic roots, the Scotch-Irish roots. So what was a shock for me when I discovered these books, and why I feel like I needed to read them, is that Thomas Dixon, the author, who was very famous, quite well-known preacher who moved to New York City in like 1905, 1910, and had a church on Lexington and 23rd Street, and was very well connected with power, Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time. And also, this book then is the source for Birth of a Nation, which is the salacious, racist film by D.W. Griffith that came out in 2015. So this book is from 1905, and it's the beginning of that rebirth of the Klan. So the Klan had been decimated basically by the federal government with Grant after the Civil War as a terrorist group, and it was recognized as such. And there's all kinds of congressional hearings that you can read about, like all the horrors that the Klan were producing. And they basically disbanded and made illegal the Ku Klux Klan. This guy, Thomas Dixon, is the next generation. So his fathers and grandparents 40 years earlier, who were the members of the Klan, and he's nostalgic for those times. So he writes these heroic books about the Klan and gives rebirth to it in 1915 when the film comes out. So the Klan would have basically been gone if it hadn't been for this book. I mean, I can't say that racism would have been, but the Klan found fertile ground in early 20th century America. And the real clincher then for me is Thomas Dixon's name, my father. So, you know, we have no direct familiar relation to the book, but I have a lot of cultural relation to the book. So when we talk about notions of subject, position, and cultural history, you know, this is my cultural history that I feel like I have to address.
And of course, you did it not only through those books, but also with the ship of your grandfather, that as far as I understood, he made it as well. And you spoke about how placing that within the exhibition, along with the Kota figures, how that is changing the context of that ship, which I think, in general, growing up with vision of ship and sea and discoveries and all, what modern history generally did was to hide the obvious fact that it's only one side of the story, and that colonialism is part of the story of modernity as well. This is something that I want to elaborate on also in the context of your solo in Beacon. But maybe first to touch upon, first of all, the ship, the inclusion of your grandfather, which makes the whole story very, very personal as well. And apart from this, I would like to flag that the inclusion of your grandfather in the exhibition is not the only quote unquote non-artist who participate in the show. You spoke about Scholar, who is part of the show, about Al, who is a collector of the Kota figures, who is an accountant of the gallery. And the contribution, I think, is immense because the Kota figure are very central to what the exhibition did. And so I think that's another interesting aspect. So maybe starting with your grandfather, which was forced into a conversation that he probably didn't envision even, right?
You're right on the money with that, and I love my grandfather and do dearly. And he's probably, artistically speaking, in the family lore anyway, my major influence. So he was not an art trained person, but was a printmaker and with, like a 6th grade education basically. But those were sort of the early 20th century notions. Times. But he was a tradesman and a printmaker, but was fascinated by cameras and built this model when he was like 25, from scratch. Yeah, and bringing my father's name into the situation too is not pleasant for anyone, considering the fact that, we're not, let's say, we're the consequence of this history, but maybe not direct authors of it. But that's the complicated conversation that has to be had, and the way that celebration can also turn. It's a little bit like, I did a piece called The Klansman, that it's a little bit like you have this kind of bloodbath, and you wake up from it like in a nightmare. You wake up from it and you realize that you have blood on your hands. So
yeah.
So, and that's culturally speaking, it's not as if my family has any more or less direct connection to these events. It's just a lot. It feeds into the personal nature of it for me to find, our name involved in it. So it's also a way to attempt to liberate the family name from such travesty. So this is the Santa Maria, but on these sails, and I'm noticing I don't have a good picture of the front. On the sail is the circle, the Celtic cross. And I remember vaguely my grandfather telling me what the different crosses meant, because on this ship, each cross was different. I think on most ships, they would have been the same, but he was interested in what the different crosses meant. So the Celtic cross, he was not aware of it being the symbol for the clan and had no truck with that kind of thing. But there it is, that's kind of the point, is like, even if you're not aware of it, it's embedded in the cultural history. So that same circle, that cross in a circle, is on the front sail of the ship, which is kind of powerful in the show, And to get back to this cross image in the platform and the ship, is that some people, like I had one woman, a Black woman, who walked in off the street and didn't really know what to expect. And I don't even think she knew necessarily she was coming to an art show. It was, she walked into the room and came running out and was like, "Is this the hull of a ship? Is this a slave ship?"
Wow.
And
so it can definitely provoke this kind of association, right? Very interesting.
Yeah, and she was confused, not angry, but moved. And in a way, I was like, oh my God, what have I done, in some way. But I never, it's the underworld started with Al Bolton, a conversation with the accountant who's the collector, who's African-American, and he goes back to Africa every year, collects traditional African art, specifically mostly from the Lobi tribe, who still exist and resisted colonialization. So their traditions are still intact. So he collects primarily from that group, but he has these kotos and others as well. But it came from a conversation with him where he was talking about sacred spaces with the Lobi and how you have to go down into these dark grottos and you have to bend down to go into them. So it's a sacred space as much as it's the hull of a ship. And it's also the underworld. This is where Achia was saying that it has different levels of reading. And everything's upside down by virtue of being in the underworld. That's partially an African tradition, but you could also see that in alchemy and other kinds of European traditions of magic, you might say. So those newspapers on the wall are upside down, and there's whitewash on them. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting off track, Achia. You wanted to know more about Cecile's involvement, which is fascinating too.
Yeah, absolutely. But I want to have enough time to see what was your response to the whole exhibition as an artist, because you took this project to Bacon and you did it as a solo in a very different way. So I would like to see that as well, just to keep 5-10 minutes for that as well.
Yeah, let me, I noticed let me show you, with Renee's piece, this little diamond shape, I made into necklaces. So I made this diamond shape, it's bronze. I made necklaces out of them for everybody that participated in the show. And so I sent that to everybody. And then just last week, 2 weeks ago, Cecile wrote me back. She's the scholar. Very important scholar right now. Robert Farris Thompson was 4 Moments of the Sun. It was some of the sort of new first wave of investigating the meaning behind the kotas for Western cultural, like I'm saying, because no one really stopped to ask. So Picasso would not have known that they were reliquary objects, very likely. So that's part of the reason why you might say he only engaged with them on a formal level, because he didn't actually know what they would have meant. So Cecile's, I call the Cecile Fremont Learning Center over here on the left. And this is a drawing that she did of one of her archaeological finds in West Africa that fuses in a lot of the opinion of scholars, fuses the African cross and the Christian cross in the cornerstone of a Christian church. So the Congo aristocracy converted to Christianity within a decade of the Portuguese first arriving. And this was kind of a shock to me. I was surprised. And it was without violence or coercion, you might say. This is kind of her point, is that it was over this conversation around the cross and this potent image of these white people coming across the horizon, as you can imagine, with these crosses on their sails, which already were embedded in this ancestral worship. So it would be, difficult to get into the head of what that seemed like. For the Africans at the time. So anyway, but there was a fusion of power there. The aristocracy saw there was power in this image, and then they used it against their neighbors, you might say. This was
so it was an adaptation rather than a conversion. It was not. It was integrated into pre-existing cultural structures. Yeah,
that's a great way to say it. And early 20th century. First century, the cross is interesting for this reason too, because the Christians basically co-opted the notion of the cross from, I think, sub-Saharan Africa and then through Egypt. So now we think of the crucifix with Jesus on it, but all this cross image of the 4 Moments of the Sun and all that pre-existed Christianity, where Jesus finds himself on the cross in Christian iconography only around the 3rd or 4th century. So, but you can see in very, very early Christian sarcophagi, so it's still pretty much Jewish, of 1st century, you see etched in the sarcophagi crosses, but they're symmetrical. They're not the Latin cross of the crucifix. So this is a lot of what I'm interested in, and Cecile's talking about some of this stuff. And so the real clincher here, and I'll get to the point, is that I made these necklaces, and then Cecile got a necklace, and she just wrote to me like last week saying that she appreciated the gift and that she wore it to Robert Farris Thompson's memorial service, because Robert Farris Thompson, the great scholar, of the Four Moments of the Sun just passed away last year, and they had his memorial service this year, and she wore the necklace with this cross diamond shape that I to the memorial service. So that was a great closing of the cycle for me.
Absolutely. David, why don't we move to your project in Beacon, which I think is fascinating. It has some of the harvesting, as you call them, in the exhibition. And my first question will be about the space, because the space is interesting in itself. The gallery is located in a space which was both a church and a bank, the ultimate combination, American or colonial combination. So maybe we'll start there and then speak about the exhibition.
Yeah, I knew. So this is Beacon, upstate New York, near Dia Beacon, just like a 5-minute walk to Dia from here, which, if you know, is where there's a lot of minimalist art, mostly American minimalist art from the 60s and 70s, 80s, housed, kind of a pilgrimage spot for artists or people that. So people come up to Beacon a lot for that reason, and then find themselves on Main Street, which is right here at the end of Main Street is this huge bank. And as you can see, architecturally, it sort of crushes everything around it. And built in 1926 or something like this, and it was built to be a bank, but changed hands a few times and then sort of went out of business. And then this church, an African-American Black church, Baptist church, got a hold of it in the 70s or 60s even maybe. And so then it had only been a bank and then a church. And then people that I know up in Beacon, the church left. I imagine the cost of maintaining this place is pretty huge. So they left and went on the market, and people I knew up there had bought it to turn it over and to renovate and sell it. So they're the same people that I knew from the show that I had done in 2017, Nick Page and Paula Ocha. Paula Ocha runs Mother Gallery up in Beacon, and now they have a space in Manhattan, and they're doing very well. But I got up there in Beacon primarily because of them. And then Nick at some point let me know that, because I knew this building and I'd seen that it was a bank and a church. He let me know that it had become available and that I might be able to do something in it. So I got very excited. And the whole show came together really quickly while the other show was still up. This was only 2 months later. And I wasn't even sure what was going to happen, because, they had contractors in there and everything. And he was like, well, we might be able to find a pocket of time. And it was very gracious of Nick to go to that extra effort to let this happen, So it happened. And we were up there for 3 weeks and got a lot of foot traffic, because people just come right in from these stores and they're like, what's going on in here? What's going on in here? They all want to see the vault, which is in the building, which is still there. So this is kind of the setup on the inside, this big empty bank. These lights were a big question whether to keep them or not. They were already in there for some event that had happened before. And at first I thought they had to go, but then it was like, no, the lights are good. And we'll get into why, just installations wise, that's true. But terrazzo floors, there's the vault still in place, which was where the church choir was before. So there were pews in here and everything that kind of covered the vault. And I even met the preacher that was the pastor of this church, the first person to walk in after opening. He even came like half hour before we were open, but the first person to come in, I'm talking to this guy, and then he's like, I was the pastor of this church. So that blew my mind, and we had an amazing conversation. And then I went to church the next week, and I don't know if we pointed that out, but I was raised Baptist. So I was raised Southern Baptist in the South. So all of this kind of Baptist symbology or symbolism is very deep in my sensibility, which this, again, if you're not familiar with baptism, which is where because it's not Christian, let's say, because Jesus himself was baptized by John the Baptist. So obviously it preceded Christianity, because Christ himself was baptized. So it's this idea of going beneath the horizon and then returning. So being transformed, and in this case, sins being washed away, but basically going below the horizon. And you see then in this representation here now of the cosmogram, like we've been talking about, I've here now somewhat scandalously fused the cosmogram with the Celtic sun cross, the circle in this, which, as we've already noted, was appropriated by the clan. So a lot of times when you look at hate sites, and you learn about the symbolism behind hate groups, is that you have to be careful because they're often appropriating already existent images. And the Celtic sun cross has no real direct relation to racism. It's just that the Klan has appropriated it. So here's a way to try to reconcile the not differences, but the immense similarities in the traditions of these seemingly disparate and even in conflict cultures. So this plywood that we see here is the floor then, see, so you can see the floor has now been repurposed. This at the bottom says the grave in letters, and that's where you went up with the ladder, you know, that's the opening. Oh, and I didn't point out these diamond shapes, which is probably a closer up picture. We'll get into those books in a minute. Maybe
so this is half of the floor now, I realize. It's only half of the floor of the gallery. Yeah.
No, it's the whole floor plus some. So the gallery, if you can see my cursor there, this would be one half of the room, and then these is the other half of the room.
Okay.
And these diamond shapes, this diamond shape is where those pedestals that had the kota in them were stuck in the floor. Because I didn't point out that those pedestals with the diamond shapes going beneath the horizon were actual hollow in the inside. So you could see up underneath when you're under the platform, up into the platform, and you could see the bottom of the kota diamond. So you were basically in the place of where the skulls would have been, you know, so you were in the world of the ancestors when you're underneath the platform. So this diamond shape, yeah, is left over from that, and this over here. So and then I had, because there are 2 levels of floor, let's say, because you need 2 levels of plywood, I had more plywood that I added to the top here because it needed that height. So you can see it folds up. These are on hinges. So it folds up like a traditional Christian Byzantine sort of altarpiece. And it embraces, the arms open up to this vault. So this is a picture from the vault with your back to here. This is the kota. This is a fang reliquary. So the fang and kota are like right across the river from each other. Had similar structure of skull preservation, ancestral skull preservation with the basket, but wildly say different representations in their sculptural traditions, which is really fascinating. So the vast difference in the kind of formal representation, but whereas they have a similar structure of the skulls in a basket with the sculpture guardian on top. Again, this being the thing that would have been cut off, sent to the West, and then what we would know as African art, but separated from the sacred skulls. So there's the vault. And
then you added something to this print as well. You did some intervention there.
To this image.
Yeah, you added a Da Vinci as well.
Yeah, that's I don't have, unfortunately, here a real close-up picture of that. Doesn't look like, but I can zoom in maybe. Yes, that works. Okay. This is first this is fang basket, bark basket. And then these are a representation of the skulls that I silk screened onto, because obviously you wouldn't be able to see through the basket, right? So there's only, from my understanding, 8 of these sculptures, fang kota, still intact in the world with the skulls in them because of this, what we're talking about, the separation that occurred and the skulls being, I guess, just thrown away, right? So a real transgression. So here, though, I've used, and this is, you know, you've opened a can of worms here, Achia, but this is the Sensus Communis, the Common Sense by Leonardo da Vinci. He drew, it's quite famous drawing of a dissected skull, realistically dissected with a cross. I'm gonna just make it there like a cross right in the center of where the brain would have been in the skull. And this was what in medieval times in classical thought, Greek classical thought, would have been where the sensus communis, the common sense, resided in the skull, in the brain, the mind, the sixth sense. So the soul, basically, this is where, and Da Vinci goes in with the new tools of science and pinpoints that spot. And to me, that's the beginning of the end for the soul in Western culture, because with the tools of science, it can't be located. So I find, and then there's a long sort of conversation that can be had about the notion of the common sense, or sensus communis in Latin, that starts with Aristotle, goes through Kant, and morphs and changes in interesting ways. So Da Vinci's looking for the soul when he locates the sensus communis. Kant talks about sensus communis in Critique of Judgment in relation to art in a really interesting way. But the sensus communis in Kant's mind is the common sense. It's what we share in common to define a we. So different groups of we, it's the understanding that fuses a cultural or social group. And those that can change. So it's like the spirit of community in some way. So Kant takes it out of the spirit, it takes it out of the realm of the transcendent, being Kant, and says, you know, we're not going to deal with God, and we're not going to deal with the transcendent space. We're going to talk about the political present and the real, and what they would define as the real. So this idea of the spirit, the world spirit, which would have been the soul, and the way that the individual connected to the larger world soul, or the animus mundi, Kant talks about in the terms of the spirit of community, the notion of we, how you define a nation, how you define a people. So yeah, that to me is a very rich representation of skulls, and the way that this was a betrayal of the sensus communis. This, you know, severing of the basket from the sculpture.
Yeah, and the object from its original world, of course, going from Africa to the museum, going through the transformations that you refer to them as well. I have so many other questions, but it feels as if we just started, as if now after this introduction, we should go on and start having the discussion. But I want also the students to participate and jump in. I will just end up with my last, I would say, comment rather than a question. There is an integration here of notion coming from colonialism on the other hand, and on the other hand, we have, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have images coming from Western tradition of enlightenment, and then from the Renaissance, Da Vinci, and there is also Courbet, which is also part of this exhibition and the previous exhibition. And I was thinking that it's interesting that in that way, regardless of the meaning which which are given in one particular work, there is a kind of juxtaposition between modernity and colonialism, which is very common nowadays in a decolonial critique, and which I think is very, very interesting of engaging with modernity. The argument which is made quite forcefully by people like Walter Mignolo and Quachino is that coloniality is the dark side of modernity, and what we really need to deal with is actually questioning our knowledge, our tradition, the Western epistemology that guides us in the academia, in art, etc., etc. And I think that the juxtaposition of Da Vinci and Cotta together makes it in a very, very interesting way, and in other instances of the exhibition. So maybe you want to respond to this, and in the meantime, I will also encourage everyone to come up with questions. You can either do it by, turning on your microphone, or writing in the text. It is up to you. Please, David.
No, you said that really well, and yeah, I embrace that kind of critique. But I take my time just to point out to the students that this wall behind this piece is harvested again, like we're talking about, from the original space, which was what I call the original space. So I just want to show a picture of that so people get an idea. These are the sheetrock walls. Sheetrock, I don't know if you build with sheetrock in India, but it's like paper sort of with plaster, a little bit of plaster in between. So they're very malleable. You can cut them up really easily. So it's a material that in building and rebuilding the gallery a lot, I've become accustomed to using. But I just wanted, this is the Cathouse FUNeral space, which there again, oh, there's the ship. My grandfather also photographed it, and this is a print, but there you can see the Celtic sun cross on it. Let me just show you leaving the last show in the original space where you can really see all of the harvested walls and everything. So that's all the shows listed from that the Cathouse FUNeral space. And then this show was a way of opening up all the walls that had been built over time. So you can see layers of walls here. So instead of painting everything white and basically whitewashing the past, we kept a lot of elements of the past. This in the corner is the original harvesting, which is a 2x4 with a pink zip down the center, if you know Barnett Newman. So a lot of this work was harvested out of earlier shows and then brought back for this show, this final show in the space. So you can see the walls are plastered here. All of this at the end, because they kicked us out of the building. So all of this I took all the walls with me. That's why they're still in that show in Beacon. So I can use them in different configurations now. Some harvestings get framed. This is from Ann Delaporte's show as smaller works. And then others are just still the full 8x4 sheet of sheetrock. So I'll end on this one. This is one of my favorite shots that captures that.
The layering of the gallery, the
harvesting.
layering.
Yes.
Very interesting. Yeah.
And that show that you used for the poster is the original show in Beacon, Leaving Home, which was probably the largest manifestation of all of these harvested walls built on with supports, like jacks on the back, so that they made temporary walls in a big open warehouse space. So that you saw that on the poster. We don't have to necessarily go back to that. Yeah. So that shows a little bit the trajectory.
Amazing. Let us try to encourage the student to speak up. It's also the student who are in the classroom. Feel free to speak up. Priyank, Priyesh, if you are there, you can coordinate this.
I would love it if any of the Pratt students are out there, that they talk to the students that you have there. That would be, to me, I mean, we're talking about this in the professional practice class, world art culture, and how, professional practice is sort of like how you get things done. But it's really New York centric and American centric or European centric in some way. But a lot of our students are from South Korea, Jordan, Nigeria. So I'm really curious about how people get things done in New Delhi art wise. I know your program is sort of a tribute to that.
Yeah.
And when I say get things done, I mean, what are the rules? What are the tax deductions? What are the consignment forms like? Is it easy to find space? How much is rent? Does the government make it easy to start a business as a dealer or as an artist? Are you sole proprietor? Are you considered an entrepreneur? That kind of stuff.
Means I think the advantage in a place like Delhi is that not everything is so regulated, and that gives lots of advantage. And there are many things which are helping. And in fact, some of our faculty are actively engaged in pop-up exhibition and alternative projects, which are very, very interesting. Some of them are also in the audience. So if they would want to say something, I can see Payal or Priyesh, anyone.
I didn't have so much of a question, but I had more of a comment. That firstly, thank you so much, David. It was really rich, and I think everyone needs more time to really engage, because there's so many layers within the exhibition that you shared, and then the harvesting of it later, again. So for me, what really stayed with me was the separation and the severing, as you say it, and yet it's holding on to the integrity of those objects. And then the way you put all of them together. So I think that is something that really stayed with me. Also, when you're talking about the separation, the space below and the space above, And just all of it, the way you, the way you curated it, as well as conceptually putting these different pieces together, or these different, practices together. I think, yeah, that is what really stayed with me. I
Thank
was
you.
very curious about one painting that we just skimmed, but we did not. If you could talk a bit about that, because I was curious about it. I think it was in the exhibition page. It was a work that caught my eye, but I want
Which
more.
painting?
If you go on to the,
Back to the exhibition
yes,
where
back
we
to
were?
the
The first show?
first show.
Yeah, I have to agree with Payal. It took me like some time to means just to understand one exhibition. One has to, spend some time to so many layers. So interesting.
I'm
And in the meantime, I'm also going to, I will request you to look into or maybe I will read it out. There is one question from Oishika. So maybe we can speak about the painting and then we will go to
Is this the painting we're
Oishika's
talking about?
question.
Or yes?
Could you talk a bit about this?
Yeah, because this is, we kind of glossed over, didn't even look at, but that is in the entranceway, and so it's sort of the source for the exhibition. You can see this sort of underworld, upside down part, and then this horizon, and then a conscious world. Yeah, this goes very deep in my own personal history. So as an undergraduate in Paris, I was in an exchange program there, and I saw the Funeral Renan by Courbet, which is in the Musée d'Orsay, right across from the artist the artist studio. This is the artist studio, and this is the Funeral Renan. So I've talked a lot of, and so I had to give a paper when I was an undergraduate on a painting, and I talked about the Funeral Renan. I hadn't quite thought about the artist studio yet. So, this is 30 years of of accrued interest. It's not like I think about it all the time, but it keeps coming back. I don't even try. It's just like, oh wow, it seems so relevant to so many things. But at the beginning of the COVID era, I was, like most people at home, and I didn't have to deal with the gallery, and I was able to kind of get back into some of my former thoughts. And I'd always thought of these two paintings together, and that they should be discussed as one entity, even though they're two separate paintings, because they're 7 years apart. And Courbet makes reference to 7 years earlier in the title for the painter studio. And I always thought, oh, the empty grave, which is here in the center of this, is 7 years later filled by Courbet painting a painting. So he replaces the void, the empty center vacated by Christ, who's up here on the left on his cross, with the self, or the painter's self. And you can really track sort of Western individualism, entrepreneurial art, to Courbet, who had his own pavilion and resisted the salon, and he called himself the most arrogant man in France. So, I mean, he was, like, say, a very full subject, and believed in the self and himself, over and against the church, over and against the aristocracy. So he was a Democrat for the Republic. And this painting is often talked about in that terms of realism, non-hierarchical structure. So the empty grave, I think, is the reason why he can structure things non-hierarchically, which is kind of a contradiction. But so there's a void at the center. There's no church, there's no monarchy, this is the beginning of kind of existential thought in some way. But again, he fills the void with himself painting a painting. And then I did a lot of variations on a kind of necromancy. In fact, one of these is titled, this one's called Necromancy. Death of the Author is this one. So but over COVID, I ordered some postcards and flipped them, and they perfectly fused together, And so I did a little bit of painting in the joints here, but basically, not only should they be read together, they actually formally work incredibly well together. Where, maybe I could go on more about, especially Courbet painting the landscape here, which is hugely significant, I think. But because he goes on to paint landscapes after this painting, where it's almost like his thesis statement for those kind of traditional, what we consider traditional now landscape paintings, the relation of the author, the painter, and the view, and then the audience who views the painting in the position that the painter once painted it. To me, that becomes the subject and the narrative in those otherwise empty landscapes, meaning they're an empty stage. There's often no persons represented or houses. It's just nature, you could say, or it's just an empty stage. I think they would have been seen in their day like an empty stage. The Dutch had painted landscape, people had painted landscape before, but they usually had something in them, like a windmill or some kind of narrative story going on. Whereas Courbet, they're just pure landscape. You could call it pure landscape. And the narrative, in my opinion, is the relationship of the viewer to the author through the painting, through the view of the painting. Anyway, that informed the structure of the exhibition with the platform.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David. I'm moving on to the next question by Oishika, who is insisting, and I think that's very interesting, on the issue of identity, of course. I wanted to ask how you approach curating a show that housed exclusively Black artists. That is, if you saw it as righting a historical wrong, exposing it, or something else, and how it influenced the exhibition. Thank you, Oishika.
Yeah, this is, I don't know if the beginning of that question was like, this is the only time that kind of scenario or that kind of setup happened. It's not as if, I haven't done other shows that had that kind of mix. And it was a I felt like as much as I was righting a wrong, I was taking a risk. I felt like I wanted to risk exposing my own racism, and I wanted to be called out for it. You know, if either by the other participants or by whomever to visit, I wanted to see if I could address the issues from my white male subject position without stumbling, you know, or maybe opening myself to some criticism or discovering a problem myself. I mean, I think there's still potential for that. As I try to unpack a lot of the layers that are in the show too, because I mean, there is, I don't know how, I mean, here there is concern always with cultural appropriation, and as a curator, you sort of inevitably appropriate. So if you're working with artists that are from, again, the subject position, different subject positions, you're inevitably appropriating them or their work or their point of view. So that has to be juggled. I mean, I haven't done the show with all white men. Maybe that's an interesting way or something to do if you're going to try to walk these different lines, you know. But yeah, it was all the artists that were in that show I've worked with before, and we've worked. I've done solo shows with Renee, as you saw, Daniel Swanigan Snow, who's an outsider, quote unquote outsider artist that I've worked with a lot. We did a lot of outsider fairs together. Frank Francis, the photographer, I've worked with him before. So everybody, we knew each other very well. So I think that that's partially how it was able to happen, because there was a lot of trust going on between us. I feel like I could go on with that question a lot more.
Yeah, I wanted just to flag something about this. What one should also take into account, the artists who are participating in the exhibition are very strong and known artists, and I encourage everyone to go and see the discussion around the exhibition here. Renee, Neri, and all, very interesting discussion and very interesting interaction with David. So I will let the video do the talking instead of me. We have another question coming from Priyesh. Thank you. Thanks a lot, David. It was very interesting for us to see the play of space in the exhibitions and the use of geometry and symbols, placing a work in a relation to another and building a narrative. How So maybe this is more of a comment, but maybe we can translate it into a question. In your work as an artist, I think, yeah, the use of space, very, very strong. Also placing the work next to one another. This, I think we didn't discuss. And maybe if you can comment few sentences about this. Deciding to put certain objects next to one another, what kind of meaning is coming out of it, etc.
Yeah, I having made films before, you know, I definitely think in narrative. So I putting images, and especially filmmaking, you know, like every shot is that putting one image next to another. So that's something that I don't know if I don't labor it. You know, it's not something that I think about in that as a method. It's just something that I do. So considering that I've worked with all these people before, their work's in my mind all the time, and it's like that game of I don't know that game, you know, that little plastic game that has numbers on it, and there's an empty space, and you move them around, trying to, I don't know, get the numbers in order. I feel like every show sort of has that quality where you're moving parts around until you get a sense of some kind of completion or some sort of whole. And almost inevitably, I have all that worked out in advance, you know, like, and I don't use SketchUp or anything like that. I just like to draw them on paper. And it's not even like a schematic drawing, you know, it's just like, okay, this is gonna, I mean, I just to keep track of things, but so I don't want to know what it's going to look like before I install it. So like SketchUp to me, if I were to do those kind of renderings, I wouldn't want to do the show in some ways. I mean, part of the joy is seeing it come together out of what you think it's going to be. So, but to answer that question is really hard. It's like I know that I have a tendency, juxtaposition, you can use that word, but I think maybe it's narrative building and just seeing how one thing leads to another. I can answer this in a good way. I early on, before I opened the first gallery, Cathouse FUNeral, I was sitting in the studio and I was thinking about 80s painting, having grown up in the 80s, like say David Salle, Julian Schnabel, Basquiat, and the way that they would use a painting like a tabletop. And I heard it described that once, you know, whereas abstract expressionism used it like a surface, painting as surface, but this was painting as a tabletop, meaning you can put anything on there, and as long as it can sit on the table, it works together, you know? So I was sitting in a studio having learned painting kind of with this model in mind, and it becoming kind of, and being sort of a habit. And I was like, well, how am I going to get out of this problem of just putting work together, juxtaposed, you know, to use the 80s term. How am I going to get out of that trope and that habit of constructing imagery? And that's when I realized that I could use other people's work in some way in exhibitions, and that led to curating. Because if you think of like David Salle, it's kind of like a curated surface. He'll put Giacometti in there and something else. So that's how I arrived basically that was one of the ways. I mean, there was a lot of different angles, but to working with others as a curator.
David, thank you so much. We are exactly, it's now exactly 8:30. As I said before, I think we can go on and on and on. And there is so much that one can explore. We didn't speak about the work of Snow and other fascinating artists in the exhibition, unfortunately.
Yeah, Daniel's not going to like that. I'm not going to let him watch this.
but his work is beautiful. I thought about him as making those modern kind of you know, magical or whatever objects which can, you know, carry a kind of mystical meaning in them, etc. So yeah, there is a lot to say about his walking stick, etc. So, but
Daniel Swanigan Snow, just to be clear for everyone. Daniel Swanigan Snow,
yeah, the full name, yeah. Okay, so David, thank you very, very much. It was fascinating. I think there is a lot to learn here about curatorial practices, about artist practices, more than anything else about how artist practice as a whole is being carried nowadays in such an interesting way, which from time to time becomes a curation, and other time it becomes a solo exhibition. Sometimes it is a response, and sometimes it's even collecting objects which are supposedly non-art objects. I also hope that we will have more opportunities to interact, that you will interact with our students, and we will find more opportunities to do that.
Yeah, I'll see. I hope Pratt is as excited about this relationship as I am. I'm new there, so I don't really know how things work, but yeah, I mean, the exchange is wonderful, I think, for the students. And Achia, I thank you for coming in the gallery and coming to
Oh,
Brooklyn.
it was the best visit in New York, as I said before. Yeah.
And whoever your friend was that encouraged you to come.
Yeah.
One day I should meet. I hope you come back to New York.
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah. Or New Delhi. You guys, I have to come and see what's
and
going on.
you will have to come here as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, David. Thank you, all the
you.
students, for participating from New Delhi and from New York. And I hope that this discussion will open the door for many collaborations. Thank you very, very much, and good evening and good morning.
Ciao.